Hi everyone, this is a quick screencast on the science of implicit or unconscious bias, something that heavily affects everybody, and especially we teachers are affected by implicit and unconscious bias without even knowing it. That is inherent in the definition of unconscious bias. We are not conscious of it. Now, this presentation is mostly about racial bias, but anything that applies to race essentially applies to all other types of bias. And there are, of course, many, many types. And bias can be as simple as just categorizing people, stereotyping people based on what you've learned about people who you think are similar to them in the past. It's completely human, and that's what we're going to understand about implicit bias. So looking at the brain, we already know a lot about these three main aspects of the brain. And it's important to understand also that this reptilian brain, or is the primal brain, the place of safety that we talk about in conscious discipline. And this is completely instinctual. This is where our brain goes and operates without our control. And then there's the emotional brain where a lot of memories are stored. And then, of course, our neocortex, that's where our executive functioning is. So the heart of the brain science behind implicit or unconscious bias is that even if we're not primarily functioning from the reptilian brain or from the emotional part of our brain, those parts of our brain are operating in the background all the time, even when we're at our best. So subconsciously, we've got all these emotions and memories and primal urges that are going on all the time in this primal part of our brain. And by primal, I mean these are literally older parts of our brain. That's why it's called reptilian, kind of thinking of it evolutionarily. Not that we evolved from reptiles, but that's kind of the idea behind that name. So there are three main parts that I want to express about implicit or unconscious bias. And the first part is what our primal brain is always doing outside of our consciousness. And it's asking these two questions. Am I safe? And what's different? It's doing that all of the time. And that is the reason that you can thank your ancestors, your long ago ancestors, for the fact that you are alive today, is because their brains were constantly asking, am I safe? And part of asking about what's safe is what's different. So we've learned about the autonomic nervous system. There are things going on in our body that go on unconscious because we cannot possibly consciously think about everything all the time. We don't consciously think about breathing all the time. We don't consciously think about our heart beating. As well, we don't consciously always notice that our brain is trying to keep us safe. So in the process of trying to figure out what's safe, the problem is that our brains are wired to keep us safe in conditions that really aren't very applicable today. We don't have lions and tigers running loose. We have very different dangers than the kind of environmental dangers that we had many, 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 many generations ago, yet our brains are still behaving that way. The second main aspect of unconscious bias in the brain is the fast and slow brain. Well, this is part of the first, actually, that primal part of our brain, it's important to understand, acts faster than our prefrontal cortex. So the part of us that's wise, that can think ahead, that can plan, the part of us that acts on our values. If we value diversity and equity and inclusion, that's our prefrontal cortex telling us that. But that part of our brain acts much, much, much slower, like 1,000 times slower than our primal brain, which is very fast and very impulsive and acting out of our control. Because it's very fast, it's also very error prone. But of course, it keeps us safe in important ways. If you're walking along and you see a snake, it's going to jump your body out of the way. And then a whole moment later, your slow brain kicks in and goes, oh, That's just a stick. That's nothing to be afraid of. So that's a good example of the difference between the fast brain and the slow brain. It often takes our slow brain a while to realize, oh, I don't need to be afraid of that stick, or oh, I don't need to be afraid of that person who's different than me. It takes a while for the slow brain to catch up. This is an exercise we'll probably do in class. So the second part that I meant to get to now is the shortcut part of our brain. So our brain uses 20% of our body energy, believe it or not, and so it really cannot work any harder than it already is, and it has to take a lot of shortcuts to do all the work that it has to do. It's wired to be as efficient as possible, and so as soon as it creates tracks in its neurons, it keeps firing those same tracks, and those are shortcuts. So if we see images of another race, for instance, that often portrays in the media or amongst our family or however, of perhaps being poor or being ignorant or being violent or constantly being victims of violence, then those paths get cut in our brain, and our brain will keep firing those same paths, completely outside of our consciousness. Those are the assumptions that we will make about people because of our shortcut brain. Also, our shortcut brain categorizes, and that's where stereotyping comes from. Categorizing is a really important function of the brain. We categorize all the time. It's just human nature, and it serves us well. We categorize trees, and we categorize the types of clouds, and we categorize types of people as well. So when we meet one person from Florida and we think they're a bad driver, this is a common joke in the South, y'all, then the next time we meet someone from Florida, instead of appreciating them as a unique person and our new friend, we might immediately categorize them as being a poor driver. That's part of human nature. So unfortunately, that means we categorize people in ways that are beyond our consciousness and that are not helpful. The third aspect and the final aspect I'm going to talk about of brain science is anthropological, the fact that we are social beings. We know this from some of our developmental theories. Humans need to belong. And the long, deep evolutionary history of this is because we are tribal people. We lived in tribes, and if we were not a member of a tribe, or let's say our tribe for some reason kicked us out of the tribe, that made us unbelievably vulnerable. Imagine a child, for instance, being not belonging to a tribe during a long time ago. That would mean instant death, essentially. We needed our tribe to protect us from the elements, from wild things in nature, and from unfamiliar tribes. So that has some good aspects to it, which is belonging to a tribe is kind of an awesome thing. We love to feel like we belong, and we nurture one another and we care for one another. The problem are the out groups and how this manifests today. Today, there's a whole bunch of different tribes of people, we all have our tribe and we all intermingle, and we cannot be deathly afraid of people who seem like they're different from us or seem like they're from a different tribe. But that's what our brains are wired to do because our brain thinks it's keeping us safe. And again, this is mostly completely outside of our awareness. And I will end with one piece of science. There are so many studies on this, and there's just one that I find to be a fairly good example of this. And it involved white people who were the participants who were taken into a room if they signed up to be a part of this study, and they watched someone on the screen drink a glass of water. The participants were hooked up to an EEG machine. that was tracking where their brain was firing in their brain waves. And the machine found that because of mirror neurons, that as the person watched someone drinking a glass of water on a screen, their brain acted as if they themselves were drinking a glass of water. Pretty cool stuff. The second part of the study is that some of those participants who were white were shown a video of someone of a different race drinking a glass of water. And quite disturbingly and surprisingly, the brain did not fire in the same way. Those mirror neurons were not going off. In fact, it often registered as if nothing was happening at all. So this study, among with many others, seems to indicate that unfortunately our brains in some cases are wired that we don't have the same amount of empathy for people who look or act differently than us. Now we can change this about our brains, and we can talk about this in class. Just because this is our hardware doesn't mean it has to be our software, so to speak. But I just wanted you to get this introduction. Thank you.